Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, thank you for joining us. This is a webinar on AS9100D, as we call it here in the Americas, or the 2016 revision, key changes and clause-by-clause presentation. I'm your presenter, Buddy Crescione. I will get several questions about whether the slides will be available in the audio of this recording, and they will both be on the PGR website at the end of this particular session. So I thank you very much for joining. I also thank Perry Johnson for inviting me to participate and provide this presentation. A little bit about me. My name is Buddy Crescione. I'm currently the chair of the America's Aerospace Quality System Committee, as well as the requirements leader for the Americas for IAQG. What does that mean? That means I have responsibility for all 26 of the aerospace standards, quality management system standards that SAE publishes, IAQG publishes. I'm also the 9100 team leader. I've been in that role since 2005, where I've been responsible for the writing, the maintenance, answering questions, clarifications. Since, like I said, 2005, so I was busy with the 2009 as well as I led the 2016 revision. I also participate as a liaison member to the ISO committee, so I'm very much aware of what they do. Also on their interpretations committee. I was involved in their writing committee, 9004 writing as well. I'm also a aerospace experienced auditor to 9100, 9110, 9120. I've actually been out doing audits for certification bodies for over 20 years. And also recently left Lockheed Martin Aeronautics, where I had over 31 years experience working for them. So anyway, that's a little bit about me. So let's talk a little bit about what we're going to talk about today during this webinar. First, I'll give you a little brief introduction about the reason for revision, the team, the timeline. We'll talk some about the principles. The principles were first developed in the year 2000 for the 2000 revision. So we can see what's the significance of the change based upon these high-level principles. We'll then talk about the C to D comparison. We'll talk about technology and the high-level structure. The structure is the most significant thing that changed. The majority of the webinar, though, will be in this clause-by-clause discussion. We'll actually go through the standard clause by clause and talk about some of the more significant changes. We'll talk about the transition summary and key dates, and we'll talk about deployment support materials. So a little bit of the introduction, just to remind you that ISO 9001 is an excellent quality management system standard. About 1.4 million companies worldwide use this standard. At least are certified to that standard, probably many, many hundreds of thousands more that use it as a basis for their quality management system. But what we were seeing in aviation, space, and defense is that many of the OEMs and the large companies started flowing down all these additional requirements, and they're very customer or company specific. So what we want to do is we want to develop our aerospace standard based upon ISO 9001. ISO 9001 is embedded in its entirety, but then add some additional requirements that the whole industry could agree on. That way, for the supply base, we had some more consistency and did not have each company flowing down something specific. Just imagine, as a good example, each company used to have their own FAI forms. Now, of course, we have an industry standard in AS9100 for FAI. And you see there are just some of the examples of some of the additional requirements that have been inserted into AS9100. So some of you may be saying, hey, didn't the standard just change? Well, actually, if you think about it, ISO 9001 has really not changed significantly since the year 2000. What ISO does is it goes through a major change, which was the year 2000, minor change. Matter of fact, they didn't even call it a change in 2008. They called it an amendment, so no new requirements were levied. So ISO really hasn't changed in 15 years. Of course, 9100, we added a few requirements in 2009. So we want to make sure that the standards always are revised, updated to adapt to the changing world, to stay relevant, to make sure that it's focused on satisfying customer requirements, make sure that we provide a consistent foundation for the future. So we anticipate the structure that we currently have in this 2016 version of 9100 remaining consistent for at least the next 15 years. Also, the environment that we operate in, there's much more international partnerships than what's been in the past. So the standard needs to reflect some of those new complexities. Also, we want to make sure that all of our interested parties, they have certain needs. We talk to them about what they want to see added to the standard, and we'll be doing that. We sent out a survey, I think it was in the 2012 timeframe, 2013 timeframe, where we asked the users, what do you want to see in the new standard? And we'll be doing that again in the 2020 timeframe. And we send it out also to all certified organizations, so all 20,000 certified organizations. So if you are the OASIS administrator for your company, you'll be getting it. Also to integrate with other management systems. One of the things is that ISO has adopted this common management system structure. So all management system standards that ISO publishes will have this exact same structure. So it'll be easier to integrate. Also it'll be easier for organizations to understand, hey, how does this ISO 14001, for example, how do I pull that into my quality system? So it'll be easier to integrate. Why does AS9100 need to change? Well, since we follow ISO, when ISO makes changes, so do we. There you see about the survey about the stakeholders. It was actually in 2013. We actually started the revision effort in 2012. Also, we have a clarification process. If you are a sector document representative, like I am for the Americas on 9100, you receive clarifications, people asking questions about the standard. So we review those and look to see, is there a way to make this requirement more clear? Also, what we have is the ones that have widespread interest and appeal. What we do is we post those clarifications in the deployment support material, and I'll cover that material at the very end of the presentation. As a result of the new standard, what we did is we relocated all the requirements for aviation, space, and defense into the appropriate section. What we did is we even tracked all the shall statements between ISO and AS9100, the additional aviation, space, and defense requirements, to make sure that the standard that we had in 2016 was just as robust as what we had in the past. Also, we wanted to make sure that the requirements are well organized, clarified. We did provide some examples, notes, to try to enhance understanding. So I mentioned these principles. How did they change? There were 8 principles there on the left-hand side that were introduced in the year 2000. And you can see now there are 7. So first, customer focus. All right. Obviously, the whole standard is about customer focus. Obviously, that's the reason why customer focus is listed first. Second, leadership. It's important to have the top management of the organization engaged in the system. If you don't have leadership, if the quality manager, for example, is trying to do it all themselves, unfortunately, I've seen those kind of systems fail miserably. It went from involvement of people to engagement. Once leadership sets the direction, it's then important for the people of the organization, the employees, to be aligned to that vision, that strategy, those objectives, to make sure everybody's marching in the same spot, going to the same goals. The process approach, critical. It's been introduced in the year 2000, and the standard is even more embracing the process approach. Systems approach to management. So that was confusing to some people. You put these processes together, you have a system. It was confusing, so that thought process was added into the process approach. From continual improvement to just improvement, factual approach to decision making to evidence-based decision making, right? We want to manage our business based upon data as much as we can. Some organizations, they have lots and lots of measures. The standard doesn't mandate a particular number. What it does mandate is that you have appropriate measures to measure your process performance, and then you take appropriate actions based upon that process performance. Okay, we'll talk some more about that. Then finally, mutually beneficial supplier relationships. Now to relationship management, a little bit of a broader term to kind of reference the fact that we have interested parties, and we need to try to understand the needs and expectations of all those interested parties. Also, let me also invite you, if you have any questions as I'm going along, there is a question box that you can type your question in, and I'll try my best to answer any questions I receive. So let's look at the comparison of Rev C to Rev D. So this is just looking at, for example, the topic of leadership. Has leadership been embellished any with regards to the transition from Rev C requirements to Rev D? So you see some different terms called like strategic, accountability, demonstrate, promote, and the number of times those words show up in Rev C versus Rev D. So you see there that there was some almost twice the amount of requirements or words regarding leadership from Rev C to Rev D. Next, preventive. Interesting, we did remove the clause called preventive action, but you see there words like prevent, issues, risk, opportunities have increased significantly between Rev C and Rev D. So yes, we did remove the clause called preventive action. That was in clause 853 in Rev C, right? It was so proactive. Where did we have it? At the very end of the standard. Then we had these additional requirements called out for preventive actions that were not intuitive to how organizations did preventive actions. It was my experience that most organizations developed these preventive action lists to satisfy their auditor and not really how they ran their business. So preventive thinking is alive and well, the new standard. It even gets introduced in the introductory material, even before the requirements. And then it's included throughout clauses 4 through 10. The process approach, as I mentioned, 360 times this was included in Rev C. So it's kind of interesting. People were like, will the process approach be enhanced, reduced, or what? You see there are almost twice the number of references to the process approach. It starts with your organization's high-level interaction of processes. What are the inputs to those? What are the outputs to those? Who's the process owner? What's the measures of effectiveness of those processes? Many of the things that we've been doing in aviation, space, and defense with our pairs now have been incorporated into the ISO text as well. Compliance, about the same amount of references doing with compliance, and then corrective, being like corrective action, action changes, and so forth. A little bit of an increase, 106 to 160 two references. So hopefully that kind of gave you kind of a feel of kind of the emphasis of the new standard. So now let's talk about terminology, because there is some new terminology with regard to the standard and this high-level structure. The high-level structure is probably the most significant change with regards to the ISO and the AS9100 text. So the first change was, in the past, we just called out products. And within the definition of products, we said, hey, products also include services. Now, several years ago, I was teaching an all-day workshop, and there was a lady who said, the standard really does not meet the needs of services. And I said, oh, no, because see here, wherever it says products, that includes services. And she challenged me. She said, you go put the word service wherever it says product and see if you could implement it. I hate to say it, but she was right. The standard was very much driven towards manufacturing and products, not so much service. So the new standard throughout now talks to products and services. So if you're a service organization, you will see that it's much easier to understand and implement, because now the standard, and it became very obvious, obviously, when we were writing it, to make sure that all the requirements could be met for services as well. Obviously, products and services are those things that are delivered to your customer that they're paying for. In the past, we used to talk about exclusions, and exclusions were limited to Section 7, which was product realization. Now, exclusions are now called applicability. So before it was more the negative of exclusions. Now we talk about how it can be applied. It can be, and also applicability or non-applicability. The non-applicability can not only is limited to Section 8 of the standard, but can be applied to the entire standard with adequate justification. One of the things we're doing is we're educating auditors to understand that probably those non-applicabilities are probably few and far between. When the standard first came out, there were numerous organizations trying to take a non-applicability to things like configuration management, product safety, all right, counterfeit parts. And I'll tell you that obviously, no matter these top contents or these topics are scalable within the standard, but there's some level of configuration management that's expected for every single entity. How do I make sure that we have the right version, the right rev level, and that what we received the order for and was quoted is what's being made and procured, sold and maintained to the customer. Product safety. You know, I would not like to be the organization to say, yeah, product safety doesn't apply to us. It's interesting because many organizations are like, well, that's something that happens in design. No, product safety, we'll talk some more about this when we get to product safety, but product safety is something that's kind of baked in. It's not something new that we just inserted in this version of the standard. It's been baked into our industry since the beginning of time. Counterfeit parts, you know, how do you make sure, what is the risk, first of all, to counterfeit parts within your products? It's interesting because so many organizations are saying things like, oh, that doesn't really apply to me. And I was reading a survey that was recently done with regards to even products that we procure on a regular basis, household things, okay? There was a case here with Dollar General where there was some counterfeit toothpaste that was being sold. I saw a study that an organization procured, I think it was like 50 some odd parts or products from Amazon, and almost half of them were counterfeit. So don't be thinking that, oh, we're immune to counterfeit, or we have never had a counterfeit problem. Counterfeit is becoming a major issue. It's been a major issue in our industry. It continues to be a major issue. All right. So from the risk to your business, what are you doing with regard to counterfeit parts? Next area, documentation, records, procedures. Now it's all called documented information. It's interesting because we used to have people who used to get into arguments about whether something was a procedure, a document, or a record. And what ISO said is, we don't care, you have to control them. And when we talk about maintained document information, we're talking about documents or procedures, retained document information being records. Purchased product, now called externally provided products and services. Supplier, external provider. So let me also say this at this point. Just because the standard is using some of this new terminology does not mean that your organization has to use the new terminology. I was recently on an audit and was going to audit the purchasing manager, and she very proudly showed me her new business card where it was not purchasing manager, it was externally provided process, products, and services manager. Obviously, that's not required, okay? Your system should be using the language and the terminology that your employees and your organization understands. So don't go be changing all your search and replace records and now call it retained document information. It's a good place to put in your quality manual, for example, if you retain that. And what's interesting is, I've not come across an organization that's not retained it, but I'm sure there's some out there. But that's a good place to go put, hey, when the standard says retain document information, we call that records. That's what I did with Lockheed Martin, right? When we came out, the whole terminology of critical items, was I going to go change every single design that had fatigue, fracture, critical parts and say, hey, they're not called critical items? No. What I did is within my quality manual, I said, hey, we have lots of different critical items. We have fatigue, fracture, critical, we have IR, this and that, and we have processes to go control those, okay? Sometimes also I'll get asked questions about definitions, all right? First, if the term is defined in the standard, that's the definition to use. If not, we use the ISO 9000 2015. If you go to the iaqg.org website, there is an IAQG dictionary. And if all else fails, it's not defined in any of those places, then we use the Oxford English Dictionary. So let's talk a little bit about the high-level structure. Talked a little bit about this already. So the standards have gone from 8 clauses to 10 clauses. It took some adjustment to understand the 10 clauses, but once you start delving into it, I think you'll find, just like I have, that it makes a lot more sense to what the old structure was. There's a better alignment to meet your business needs. It focuses on this plan, do, check, act type structure. All ISO management system standards we built on the same structure. And this is a structure of the standard. This does not necessarily mean that this is the way you need to go about using it as a model for your particular processes within your organization. So here's what it is kind of at a high level. We have first the planning. We talk about clause 4, the context of the organization, understanding the organization in its context. 5, leadership. 6, planning activities. 7, support processes. That's all up front as part of planning. The doing, the automotive industry calls these customer-oriented processes because we're taking inputs, requests from the customer, processing those into outputs for the customer. This used to be called product realization, kind of the same flavor as what that is. We now call it operations. You can see there it goes from planning to how we do contracting, design development, purchasing, build, release, support of the product. Check, performance evaluation. How do we check that our system is still maintaining itself? By monitoring, measuring, analysis, evaluation, internal audit, management review, and then finally, the ACT, all right, the improvement cycle, corrective actions, improvement. So I already mentioned that there's no requirement for your documentation to reflect the structure or the terminology of the standard. So I know that some organizations build their procedures around the clauses of the standard. All right, if you want to continue to do that, that's great. But first of all, there's no requirement to go do it. But if you want to go keep it to the 8-clause structure of the 2009 version, just be aware that you'll be having this mismatch of kind of where's Waldo, because this new structure is going to be in place for at least the next 15 years, probably longer. But if you're going to go change your structure, what I would encourage you to do is to look at your value stream, your interaction of processes, and organize your procedures, your documentation around your business processes. All right, that way, that is something you control. All right, and also it's something that is meaningful because it's set up as far as a structure for your particular organization. The benefits is a common management system, focus on plan, do, check, act, and clear, better organization of requirements. So I've talked already about value streams, interaction of processes. Here's just an example where you have, here's your customer-oriented processes that meet the requirements of Clause 8. You have some governance or some management processes, and then you also have some supporting processes, okay? Just an example, not meant to say this is the preferred list, just an example. So let's do some clause-by-clause discussion. The way we have these next slides identified is that if it deals with an ISO 9001 requirement, it's in kind of like these beige boxes. If it's one of these specific aviation, space, and defense, it's in a pale blue. Of course, AS9100D includes both the ISO text and the pale blue. We just wanted to provide some background of the origin of some of these changes. Also, we have some information, some takeaway slides on some new areas of the standard. All right, so first of all, the forward, revision summary, rationale, intended application, no real changes there. Even in the introduction though, 0.1, the general, one of the things the standard did, the ISO standard did, is it defined what does shall, should, may, and can mean. All right, let's see. I just saw that we have a question. I apologize that, will we have access to the slides after we're done? Yes, you will. They'll be on the website. No, sorry about that. I don't know why that happens, but when I get out of slideshow mode, it goes back. So, but yes, you will have access. The slides and the audio will be posted on the PGR website. Quality Management System Principles. I mentioned the fact that these were introduced in the year 2000, and this is what the ISO 9001 was based off of. What's interesting is that they were never included as part of ISO 9001. In order to go look at those principles, you had to go look at ISO 9000 or 9004. Well, the principles are now included within the standard. There is more verbiage, more explanation about what those principles are in 9000, but it is now listed here. The process approach. More focus on the process approach. As I mentioned, almost twice as many references to the process approach, We also include a diagram of a process representation. I will tell you it looks a whole lot like a SIPOC, but it has some different terminology associated with that. Then we're getting into the requirements section, scope, normative references, terms and definitions. A couple of new definitions on counterfeit part, product safety has been added. So what is the process approach? The systematic management of processes and their interactions to achieve intended results. You use your processes as to set the interrelated interacting activities, how we transform inputs into outputs of each of the processes, as well as at a macro level. Build in checks to meet objectives and promote continuous improvement. So I can't stress how important, if you're developing a system from scratch, the first thing you would go do is go develop and understand your processes. For organizations whose processes have been developed for a long time, it's kind of awkward to go back and say, so what are the main processes? But please don't shortcut that, because the rest of the standard is built upon your processes. Here's just another example on the right about showing some different processes. It integrates into a holistic system to achieve your strategic and operational objectives. Should be how your organization runs, how you add value. The process approach incorporates risk-based thinking. So every step along the way, your processes need to consider risk and how to go be proactive so we don't have an impact with regards to risk. Once again, the process approach, PDCA, Plan, Do, Check, Act. You see there some of the terminology: plan, how we set objectives and build the processes necessary to deliver results. Do, we implement what was planned. Check, to make sure that we're meeting the needs. And then act, take actions to improve results. So what's interesting about this is that you see the standard is based upon PDCA. Okay. I will also tell you that some auditors, including myself, we audit PDCA. So if I go talk to somebody, the first thing I'll ask them is, how are your activities planned? Do you have procedures? Do you have work instructions? I'm on the factory floor. How do you get parts? How do you prioritize work? Okay. Then what do you do? Step by step. How that work checked, and then how do you act upon that based upon those checks? If you're to have a nonconformity, what happens? Okay, and then obviously, if you have a nonconformity, then you have another Plan, Do, Check, Act activity that supports that. So I would encourage you, for your internal audits as well as your own processes, to consider Plan, Do, Check, Act. So what processes need to be defined? I would encourage you to go take a look at clause 4.4. All right. For example, inputs. What are the inputs to each of your different processes? What are the outputs? What's the sequence and interactions, the resources? Who's responsible? All right. This is typically like your process owner. What's the risk and opportunities associated with that process? How are you monitoring those? And the performance indicators, right? We've been conducting audits according to processes for numerous years, right? We do that using our pairs, our process effectiveness assessment reports with regards to that activity. There's lots of ways to go document this information, including flowcharts, routines, maps, procedures, to ensure the effective implementation of your processes. So let's talk now about clause 4, context of the organization. Pretty much a whole new area of the standard. So in the past, in the 2009, you would see something about the organization environment up front in the materials, in the introduction. So this is all about understanding the environment in which your organization is operating. If you do strategic planning activity of your organization, you're probably doing a lot of this activity in your strategic planning. You see there that we need to determine the relevant external and internal issues. All right, you see there things like, let me move this box out of my way so it's going to get me back in there. So sorry about that. Legal. Within my business, do I understand all the legal, all the regulatory types of requirements necessary for me to go do my business? Technological. What's the technology required? Is there certain equipment, machinery? Is there certain tolerances that the customers are expecting? Can I deliver those? Competitive. Do I have that market niche where I can go be successful as part of my business? The market. What's the market doing? Is the market flat? Is it growing? If it's growing, do I have planned activities to be able to go meet that demand? If it's declining, what am I doing to diversify myself so I can stay a viable entity? Cultural, especially as we do business multinational or international activities, important to understand culture, social, economic environments. The internal issues is how do those match up with regards to our own, for those external issues, how do we meet those? Do we have the values, the culture, the knowledge, the performance to go meet up with those types of things? Okay. So I've received lots of people saying, you know, hey, that AS9100 and that ISO 9001 has gone too far. All right. You're asking me a lot of questions that are way outside quality. Well, I guess I'll just kind of ask the question. When you go do activity with regards to qualifying suppliers, don't you check about their viability? Don't you want to go do business with somebody who's going to be around and not somebody who's going to be out of business in 6 months? That's what this is getting at, is making sure that you've done the upfront analysis to make sure that you're a viable entity and continue to be so. So, as you know, for aviation, space, and defense, we're required to interview top management annually. Man, this is a perfect topic to talk to top management about. This is what they do, day in and day out. So this is also a time, I'll tell you a funny story. I taught a class, and we really delved into this topic. And they kind of told me, and says, yeah, what's funny is that we had a bunch of quality people get together and decide what the organization's context was. And for days, we agonized over this, and we came up with a list of here's our context of the organization. So we shared it then with our whole cross-functional implementation team. And they're like, that's not what it is. So they took that and then they massaged it all over. Here's what it is. And this multifunctional team said, that's what it is. And they took it to leadership. And guess what leadership said? That's not the organization's context. All right. So one of the aspects of this is, from whose perspective is this being developed? And the answer is top management, because this is a top management type of activity. It's not done by the worker bees. It's not done by a bunch of quality people. It's done through the vision of top management. Okay, enough with that. Understanding the needs and expectations of interested parties. Determine the relevant interested parties. So the first thing you do is, who are my interested parties? Second, which of those are relevant and what are those requirements? Okay, they include things such as customers, partners, authorities. We have some backup information on this topic as well. Determining the scope of the system and any justifications where the requirement cannot be applied. We've had scope requirements before, but this is a good time to go take a look at your scope and make sure that it's adequate, that it reflects what your system is doing. Quality management system and its processes, right? What's that? one of the requirements in there is that, hey, you're going to have document information to be maintained or retained to the extent necessary to show that your system is operational. For 9100, we also added explicit requirements for document information to be maintained or retained. So we also have some more information on that in the upcoming slide. So first, let's talk a little bit more about interested parties. If I look at the definition in ISO 9000, 2015, it says stakeholder, person or organization that can affect or be affected by or perceive itself to be affected by a decision or activity. That even perceive itself, kind of opens up the aperture pretty wide. But one of the things I would caution you about before you get too excited is that's interested party. Throughout the entire standard, we talk about relevant interested parties. Okay? Examples of interested parties, things like employees. Obviously, if I'm going to go put together a management system, I want it to be easily usable and understood by the people in the organization. Management, all right? They need to understand and be able to lead the organization. So yeah, organization owners, unions, suppliers, customers. Yeah, probably should have customers listed first because obviously they're the most important interested party that you have. Without customers, you cease to exist. Partners, all right? If you have partnerships, how do you consider their needs and expectations as part of your system? Regulatory authorities, FAA, NASA, DoD type requirements, okay? Certification organizations, all right? So you need to go determine first, who are your interested parties, which of those are relevant, what are those requirements, and how do they apply? So one of the things you'll see, for example, is throughout the whole standard, we talk about interested parties, but that whole long list doesn't apply everywhere. I'll give you an example. In design and development in 8.3, it talks about the needs of interested parties. Am I going to go talk to the union, regulatory authorities with regards to my design requirements? I don't know, maybe, maybe not. So what you need to then look at is that here's my interested parties, here's how they're relevant, and here's how they apply within my quality management system. Usually I see this as like a table. Of course, I'm a table kind of guy. I kind of like tables. It provides information, very structured, very simple to understand, where you'd have, here are the relevant interested parties, here's how they're relevant, and here's how they impact my quality management system. Also, by the way, I've also seen organizations as they're doing that to then say, is there certain risk associated with those interested parties too, or opportunities that we have? So the scope of the quality management system, as I mentioned, no longer refers to exclusions, talks about the applicability of your system, right? There's not a one size fits all. It's based upon the size or the complexity. That's why it drives me nuts when I would see organizations go buy the quality manual and all your procedures. That's awful, because the way that quality manual and procedures are structured may not at all fit your particular organization. So the larger the organization is, the more complex, usually the more procedures we'll see with regards to that. As an example, when I oversaw the quality management system for Lockheed Martin, 27,000 employees across 10 locations. We had hundreds of people doing contract review. Did we have a procedure for it? You bet. All right. The smallest company I ever went to was a 2-person machine shop in Arkansas. The owner did contract review. Does he need a procedure for that? Heck no. He knows how to go do that. So a lot of the size and complexity will have an impact with regards to the system. The management model of the organization, it's important. If your quality management system is not effective, then you've not designed it properly. All right. What do you mean by effective? All right. If you're doing something just because you believe AS9100 says you have to go do it, all right, you've not done it properly. The standard tells you what to go do, not how to go do it. I've seen some very silly ways that organizations have gone and implemented the standard. And if you're doing something just because the standard's telling you, you probably need to go look at that process. The range of the activities, the nature of the risk and opportunities, okay? Once again, you can determine if something's not applicable, but you can only do that if it will not result in failure to achieve the conformity of products and services or the enhancement of customer satisfaction. You must justify any non-applicabilities. And I will tell you that the justification expectation has been elevated. We have communicated that to the certification bodies. So for example, in the past, if I was a build-to-print machine shop and I claimed an exclusion to design development, sometimes I'd just say, yeah, we don't do design development because we're a machine shop. We're a build-to-print machine shop. No longer is that justification adequate. I would expect to see something along the lines of, we are a build-to-print machine shop. We only do work to customer drawings. If there's any changes to customer drawings, they're coordinated with the customer. So we do no design and development, okay, as an example. For aviation, space, and defense, I would think that any non-applicability outside of Clause 8 would be unusual, but not unheard of. I'll give you an example. So if I'm a service organization, like let's say that engineering design house, all right, I have no calibrated equipment. Would there be, that calibration is now included in Clause 7 of the standard? Would I expect to see them take an exclusion for that or non-applicability? Absolutely. Okay. So the standard requires you to establish and maintain documented information describing things like interested parties, the scope, process description, sequence of interactions, responsibilities, and authorities. The beauty of the standard is that we have this thing called now documented information. In the past, we used to have requirements for quote unquote documented procedures that didn't really allow organizations much flexibility in how they met the requirement. Now, with documented information, it could be documents, web pages, wikis, you name it. So you have additional flexibility. So the important thing is how do we communicate information, expectations with regards to the system and communicate it well? Okay, that was Clause 4. All right, I don't see any questions, so we'll move on to Clause 5, leadership. So what you'll see is an embellishment in this section for leadership, all right? It's not just about responsibilities, it's how they demonstrate those responsibilities. In the past, we've always tried to make sure, before the year 2000, we had a quality management system that was very documentation intensive. And the way organizations operated and how their quality management system operated were sometimes not harmonized. Since the year 2000, the QMS is pretty much integrated to how the business operates. That's been the case, but now there's actually an explicit requirement to show that to be able to have the integration of the quality management system to business process. The policy, with regard to the quality policy, needs to be aligned with the strategic organization. Hey, that only makes sense, right? the policy is supposed to be like the North Star. It's like when you're in your ideal state, what will you look like? All right, or what's the philosophy you're striving for? Your strategic direction should be aligned to that. All right. And if it's not, you need to get the two kind of aligned so you're striving, you're all going the same direction. Then obviously you'll have objectives, right, on how you're going to go reach that strategic direction and those policies. Organizational roles, responsibilities, authorities. You see there, management representative. Well, why is that new? That's been around forever, right? Actually, ISO 9001 chose to remove the requirement for a management representative. Why do you ask that? Well, what ISO was trying to do was ISO was not wanting to see top management and leadership just dumping, excuse the expression dumping, this responsibility on somebody called the management rep, usually some poor soul over in quality. So what ISO did is they took those requirements for the management representative and put it up there in top management in 5.1. So why is it here in blue for a 9100 additional change? The problem with that, first of all, in aviation, space, and defense, we agree that top management is critical. That's why we interview them annually to the quality management system. But top management can still delegate those responsibilities, and they can delegate those responsibilities to multiple types of people. So you no longer have a single person that's responsible, has the responsibility and authority for the quality management system. So we thought that was important, so we added it back in for 9100. Clause 6, planning. This is where risk and opportunities come in. Determine the risk and opportunities, considering the issues raised, the requirements identified, plan the appropriate actions to reduce undesirable effects on the QMS and evaluate the effectiveness. So if you remember right, in the year 2009, we came up with product-related type risk, right? We had it there, it used to be in clause 7.1, now it's in 8.1. And what's interesting is when we were discussing that for the 2009 revision, we were thinking, should we just isolate it to kind of the product realization or open it up to the whole quality management system? And the decision was, as in 2009, it would be product realization. 2016, it would be the entire QMS. Well, guess what? ISO did it for us. So that's how this is different than what we have with regards to, and we call it now operational risk management. So in operational risk management, and we'll talk about this in a couple of charts, but right, very formalized approach for how you go do risk and opportunities. It's how do we address risk and opportunities throughout our whole entire quality management system. And I think I have a couple backup charts. All right, 6.2, quality objectives and planning to achieve them. Planning the achievement, more prescriptive, it includes the evaluation of results. If you look at the clause in the standard, it actually talks some about more details about who's going to be responsible, what's the time frame, how are you going to go verify results. So make sure that your objectives meets those new requirements in 6.2. Planning of changes, we used to call this QMS planning. Just making sure your system is in a planned, is performed in a planned manner. This is the kind of the top level planning of the whole QMS, right? We also have planning called out in 8.1. We talk about planning for operations. We have planning called out for design and development. On how are we going to plan our design and development activity? So if you think about it, this is the macro level planning that we're talking about here. Okay. What's risk-based thinking? That's what this clause 6.1 is sometimes called, risk-based thinking. And a lot of times people are overthinking this. It's something we do automatically, and it's what we do subconsciously to try to anticipate problems. It's always been implicit with regard to the standard. This version of the release makes it more explicit. You look at it from the beginning of the processes. So even I'm developing my processes, where the risk baked into this, and it makes prevention part of strategic and operational planning. So we recommend you use a risk-driven approach throughout your organizational processes. You identify and prioritize. What are we looking for? What's acceptable processes? What's acceptable performance? What's unacceptable? Then you plan actions, right? How can I avoid, eliminate, or mitigate these risks? Take action, implement the plan, look for the effectiveness. Does it work or not? And then improve. So we're trying to change from a culture of being reactive to being proactive. This is how you really focus on priorities and adding value to the company, making sure that you align your resources to risk and the issues. I've been always a big cost-benefit analysis fan, and that's all about understanding where the risk is in your organization and making sure that you have the resources, the cost to get the maximum amount of benefit. All right. Greater knowledge of risk improves preparedness. You increase your probability of reaching objectives. We anticipate problems beforehand and reducing the probability of negative results. So with regard to this, it's not totally new. It's something you may already do. It's continuous. It makes prevention a habit. Talked about change, and this being kind of the 6.3, kind of being the overall quality management system change. Here you see several other clauses where change is talked about, including things like organizational knowledge. Right? I don't want to just, when I understand what my organizational knowledge requirements are, they're not static. They're changing over time. How do I make sure that I keep those up to date so we keep those relevant? Okay, controlling operational planning, changes planned and unintentional in 8.1. Talk about changes to contract requirements and how do I communicate those, changes to design and development, changes to my production service provision. So the whole intent of the focus on change management is to ensure business continuity when changes occur. We obviously want adequate planning up front to make sure that we continue to maintain our processes, continue to deliver products and services to our customer, that we look at potential consequences, and that our integrity of our quality management system is maintained. Okay, that's it for Clause 6. Now getting to Clause 7. These are the supporting processes. Starts off with 7.1 with resources, kind of like 6.1 did in the old standard, the 2009. You see there's a general section about general resources, people, infrastructure, all right, environment for the operation of processes. I will tell you that the environment includes human and physical factors. So we want a work environment which is conducive to providing quality products and services on time to the customer, okay? A lot of people have gotten kind of excited about the note and examples within a note, okay? Just make sure you understand notes are for guidance, right? They're not auditable, right? And examples are just provided for clarity, all right? But I think you would agree that if you want the right environment for your employees, that you're going to maintain an environment which is positive, where people, don't hate coming to work or is abusive, because your system overall is going to struggle with that. Okay? 715, monitoring and measuring resources. What are the resources required? So this can be the resources required for here's the points of where we're going to do monitoring and measuring and who's going to go do it, as well as calibration activities are included with regards to 715. 716, organizational knowledge. All right, it's the necessary knowledge gained from experience, lessons learned, successes, failures, conferences. There's a term that's been used in the past called tribal knowledge. How do we capture that tribal knowledge to make sure that as people leave the organization, we once again can keep our organization stability, that we can continue to share that information. 7.2, competence. What's interesting is that every time the standard comes out, there's less and less words of training and more focus on competence of employees. Training is obviously one way to be able to go have employees meet that competence requirement, but it's not the only way. So the focus is competent employees performing the work, and then you determine what those competence requirements are. But the days of train, all right, are over with, all right. Awareness, because a lot of times, before I go that I don't mean to say that, start cutting all your training. No, that's not what I'm saying. But in the past, it was viewed that, hey, we'll just train people and therefore people would be competent. And there was not ever evaluation of the training effectiveness or not. All right. Or sometimes there is recurrent training. We'll retrain people every year. And there was really no value or benefit to it. So once again, the focus is on competence. 7.3, awareness. Several things have been moved into this, including things like awareness of the quality policy, awareness of changes to procedures and processes in the quality management system. There was a couple of things added with regard to the 9100. All right. First is, how do employees contribute to product or service conformity? How do they contribute to product safety, the importance of ethical behavior? So one of the things I do, especially when I'm on transition audits, I ask every organization I go to these questions. Why are these questions in there? These questions are in there because we want to get away from the culture that, hey, quality is responsible for product and service conformity. No, everybody is responsible for product and service conformity. Everybody's responsible for product safety. And ethical behavior is baked into everything that we do in aviation, space, and defense. And no matter whether I'm talking to somebody in contracts, engineering, purchasing, production, support, I would expect to be able to understand, here's how they contribute, all right, to conformity, product safety, the importance of ethical behavior. So I ask that question. I also ask questions about organizational knowledge, just about every organization or every team I go to, right? Because a lot of times it'll be different. How we capture organizational knowledge for engineering is different than how we do it out on the production floor. It's different than how we do it in purchasing. Communication. Typically in the past, for quality management systems, we've been focused on communication, internal communication. Well, now it includes external communication as well. This was one of the requirements in ISO 14001. So going back to a topic we talked about earlier, who would we anticipate internal and external communications coming from? How about interested parties? Yeah, okay. One of the things I failed to mention was that one of the new requirements in the policy statement is that your policy needs to be available to interested parties as well. So as you can see, how you define some of these things up front will kind of follow through the entire standard. 7.5, document information, right? New terminology replaces documents, records, all right? Before there was these 6 mandated procedures, right? Those 6 mandated procedures are no longer required, but for aviation, space, and defense, we did still require 2. Those 2 being nonconformity and corrective action. What I'm typically seeing is that organizations still are maintaining the 6 just because they feel like it's good controls, okay? Under control document information, some additional requirements for data protection processes, all right? For information we retain electronically, how do we have backup provisions? How do we ensure that we are we're free of viruses, that we have controls over our system? Okay, a little bit more discussion on organizational knowledge, all right? To safeguard the organization from loss of knowledge through turnover, failure to capture, share information, to encourage the organization to acquire and share the information. Now, a lot of times people are real busy, right? And especially the best employees are usually the busiest. But I would encourage you, please go talk to those best employees about the acquiring of organizational knowledge. All right, what you don't want to do, obviously, is hey, Jack is a terrible employee, he never can make conforming parts. Let's go capture his organizational knowledge for the future. That's not what you want to do, obviously. All right, so implementation considerations, excuse me. Activities to benefit from lessons learned. Make sure you identify experts to transfer knowledge on job training, tutorial, implement succession planning activities. All right, so what are some ways you're seeing this done? All right, lessons learned databases. I would caution you though, I've seen a lot of organizations go develop lessons learned databases, then they don't use them. Don't put it together, spend the labor and time to go do it if you're not going to go use it. It's like they record lessons learned whenever they have problems. It's like, well, look at this. We had this corrective action. We put in the lessons learned database. So it was already there. Well, I guess we should have looked there before. No, I don't know why, but software organizations, engineering organizations, very good with utilizing these lessons learned databases. What are some other ways? The documentation of the work, adequate documentation can be part of organizational knowledge. Procedures can be part of organizational knowledge. Your competency matrix that you may have out on the production floor saying which employees can do which types of tasks. If I'm 1 or 2 persons deep in a particular task, right, how do I cross-train more people, right? So if one of those 2 people leave, I'm not stuck not having organizational knowledge. So cross-training, mentoring, all those are different types of organizational knowledge, and you can do it different ways in different organizations. That's fine. Awareness. I mentioned here about we're trying to expand the thinking that these topics are just the responsibility of quality. All right, how do you go then communicate these awareness activities? It can be through direct communication of expectations from leadership to managers to employees. It could be communication campaigns. It can be having focal points, communicating this responsibility, formal training. So what you're looking for is you want this to have employees be able to articulate this in their own words and how they contribute to quality. You don't want some just memorized, rattled off, all right? Just like when you talk to an employee about the policy statement. And whenever somebody starts trying to read from a badge tab or a poster, I stop them and say, no, I don't want to know about that. What it says is you need to understand it. What does it mean to you as a engineer? What does it mean to you as a purchasing person? What does it mean to you as an operator? This is the same kind of thing. People should be able to articulate this. Also, I've gone to several organizations who have not done training on this or awareness on this. All right. And just, oh yeah, our employees know this stuff. And usually they're coming up short. So I would encourage you to go take a look and how we can go make sure that people can articulate how they contribute to product service conformity, product safety, and the importance of ethical behavior. The importance of ethical behavior, does this mean I need to have an ethics organization or something real formal? No. It means about having a culture where employees understand their responsibilities, that managers are listening to employees, recognizing their work, reporting, not passing on defects or nonconformities, that we have a culture that doesn't allow unethical behavior. If you have ethical issues, it could be damaging to your reputation. It can also be illegal, criminal, so just beware. Now, with the comment about you don't need to have an ethics office, but what you do need to have is you do need to have an independent method for employees to be able to go register complaints or concerns, okay? So when I talk to an employee about the importance of ethical behavior, usually I always do it when a supervisor is crowding me, and I'll ask, what would you do if there was an ethical issue? Because 9 times out of 10, they would say, bring it up to my supervisor. And then I turn around and say, what happens if the ethical issue was your supervisor? What would you do then? Okay? And that's important. It can be, I would take it to the next level of the next level management. That's fine. I can go take it to HR, ombudsman, ethics officer. Okay? They need to have an elevation path with regards to ethical behavior and any concerns. Document information. As I said, no requirement for the 6 documented procedures. It's kind of funny, really, because I remember as we were developing the standard and we talked about, you know, hey, these 6 documented procedures were no longer required, and ISO has reduced the rigor of documented procedures. Now you can use other methods for communication. The industry was like, oh my God, there's going to be like bonfires of people burning procedures. And to be quite honest, in all the transition audits I've done, I've not really seen companies just totally purging procedures. But think about it. How many organizations had a quality manual and 6 documented procedures? Not very many. So organizations have already determined when there is a need for documented procedures and documented information. All right. So the organizations needs to maintain documented information, things like interested parties, the QMS scope, process description, sequence interactions, responsibilities, authorities. Those things are called out in clause 442, quality policy objectives. As I said, aviation, space, and defense requires you still to have documented information on nonconformity corrective action, and you can use various methods to meet the requirements. Also, you remember back in the old days when we used to have C clause 424 for whenever there was a record requirement? Some organizations believe that was the only time there was a records requirement. No, that was just a minimum. It's always been the requirement in the standard that you retain document information, records, to have confidence that the processes are being carried out as planned. Okay, so that's clause 7. Now clause 8, operational planning and control. What you'll see is that you won't see paragraph titles or clause titles for project management and work transfers. The words are still in there, but the titles have been removed. Especially project management, that clause title was confusing. It was always meant to be just an extension of upfront planning, okay? So we have the exact same words, but those titles are different. The titles have been removed. What you'll see throughout the standard is more focus on planning. Also, in the past, we've focused on quality, but not so much on-time delivery, right? Part of the mantra of IAQG is on quality, on-time delivery of products and services to the customer. And therefore, cost will follow if you focus on quality and on-time delivery. When people can be like, well, my gosh, this is a quality standard. Why are we focused on on-time delivery? If we don't have on-time delivery, quality always suffers, right? We're doing things out of station. We're impacting delivery to the customer, all right? There's also a focus on preventing delivery of non-conforming products and services to the customer. We are still seeing significant amounts of escapes going to the customer. So what are you doing to try to prevent the delivery of non-conforming products and services to the customer? And please tell me you're not just going to go put more levels of inspection in. How do we make sure that we catch things earlier, that we have effective gates within our process? And if we do have an escape, are we taking robust corrective actions to ensure it doesn't recur? The other thing you'll see is more engagement of functional representatives. You'll see it here up front in the planning, right? Why would you do planning and not get all those people who are going to be responsible for following the plan engaged in the plan? So you'll see it here. You'll see more focus on functional engagement and contract review and design reviews. We also have a note about integrated phase processes as a measure to achieve operational planning and control. For those of you who are doing APQP, PPAP, that term should sound familiar to you. This isn't a note. There, we have released a new standard. IAQG has AS9100D on APQP PPAPs. That does not mandate, 9100 does not mandate APQP PPAP within the standard. It is a way to go meet the requirements. Therefore, we have notes. You see here it talks about note, where we reference that is a way to satisfy the particular requirement. Operational risk management. All right. This was in clause 711 regarding operational risk and operational processes. Somebody asked me the question, why operational risk management? Before it was just called risk management. Well, we wanted it to reflect different from 6.1 operations. This section's called operations. We call it operation risk management because it's the risk focused with the operational processes, right? While 6.1 is related to risk of the entire quality management system. Configuration management. So in the past, what we did, or I should say in the last revision, we referenced ISO 10007, which is kind of like the Bible of configuration management. But we used also some terminology from ISO 10007, things like configuration status accounting, which some small organizations thought that was something their CPAs did, or configuration audit. Well, that's something my auditors do. So what we did is we took configuration management and we made it simpler, easier to understand English. Product safety. All right. Probably should change this slide about new requirement. It's new within the standard, but like I said, it's been baked into our industry from the beginning of time. And how do we consider product safety through the whole product life cycle? You can see there with the little I have additional slide on this. prevention of counterfeit parts, prevent the use of counterfeit or suspect counterfeit parts. So once again, let's talk a little more about risk management. 6.1 talks about risk within the QMS at the organization process level. 811 is talking about risk from an operational process perspective, right? What is that risk associated with getting business, do contract review? What's my risk dealing with my design and development? My risk dealing with suppliers, my risk in production, my risk in servicing, okay? It requires a formal process to manage risk. We adopt the process to the organization and to the product, and we deploy risk analysis within the operational activities. In Annex A4, some good information about risk management, where it talks about with the ISO 9001, it talks about that risk-based thinking, to use it as a preventative tool, to provide greater flexibility. And we added some additional text within the 9100, right? Talking about severity and likelihood, and deal to the complexity about a formal process to manage the operational risk. Product safety. All right, how do we address product safety throughout the product life cycle? The reason why this is kind of came onto the, was inserted within the standard was right now ICAO, that's the International Civil Aviation Organization, is implementing something called the Safety Management Systems Standard. ICAO is the group that defines these requirements that are then adopted by groups like the FAA here in the United States. All right. Now, full SMS is not required for AS9100, but we thought that it would be smart to include some product safety considerations with regards to the standard. So one of the things we did is we were very careful to make sure there was not confusion between product safety and personnel safety. So whenever we talk about safety, we categorize it as either product, personnel, or person safety. So it recognizes the importance of safety, recognition also by the authorities as part of our strategy stream. Product safety is defined as the state in which a product is able to perform to its designated or intended purpose without causing unacceptable risk of harm to persons or damage to property. Some ways to go about doing that. FMEA is a way to go do it, either through a design or process, perform safety analysis, identify and mitigate risk. And obviously, if you have safety critical items coming from your customer, you've already had identified, here are some certain areas where you have safety critical type items. Whenever you have occurred events affecting safety, right, it's expected you're going to collect information about potential or occurred events, analyze their impacts, escalate anything, make sure you coordinate with interested parties, look for trends, and then you're going to communicate. You're going to promote a safety culture, lessons learned from occurred events. It's natural for organizations to not want to publicly talk about occurred events, but it is critical to make sure those events do not recur. Before I get finished talking about product safety, some of you are probably like, buddy, I'm a build-to-print machine shop, all right? I don't even know what my parts go into, okay? Or I'm a tube bender. I don't even really know how these tubes are being used. So at a minimum, product safety is building the product in accordance with the engineering and requirements of which you're provided. All right, let me tell you a story. Metal tube bender, right? All they're doing is just bending metal tubes. And they unfortunately did not have the lubricant that was required. This happened to be a bone example, by the way. excuse me, but they didn't happen to have the lubricant that Boeing spelled out in their specs. They used something else. The tube was delivered to Boeing, put on an aircraft. It was used for an oxygen line. Guess what? The lubricant the company used caused flashing in that tube all the way down the fuselage of the aircraft, which caught the fuselage of the aircraft on fire at the Boeing facility. All right. I hate to say thank goodness, but thank goodness it happened at the Boeing facility and not while the aircraft was up in the air. All right. So sometimes product safety can just be, I built it the way it was planned. I had a clarification request coming from an organization saying, I build circuit boards. Talk to me about product safety. All right. Obviously, it's a good practice to try to know what your products are going into. But if you don't, what are the controls we have for circuit boards? We have ESD protections, right? We have FOD protections. We test the boards before we deliver them, all right? So those are some things in consideration to product safety. Counterfeit parts prevention, all right? We actually had counterfeit parts requirements in AS9110 and 9120 in the 2009 release. Unfortunately, we did not reach back and pull those forward in the 9100. We've done that now. We're trying to mitigate the effect of the growing threats of counterfeit fraudulent product. Right, we just have now a big one with a major metal provider in Japan with regards to falsifying test reports. So counterfeit parts, alive and well, recognize the statutory regulatory requirements as well. Counterfeit parts, an unauthorized copy, imitation, substitute, or modified part which is knowingly misrepresented as specified genuine part of an original or authorized manufacturer. So sometimes I'll get a question, how is counterfeit parts different from just normal nonconformities? All right, and it's this knowingly misrepresented, okay? As my example earlier, it can be materials, it can be test reports, it can be a lot of different things, okay? Things to consider: training, awareness of counterfeit parts. Procurement personnel, bless their hearts, they are rewarded for finding cheap parts. So make sure that our procurement processes only allow us to procure from select sources that have been approved, and that if something is not available through one of those sources, we have the appropriate mitigation, the appropriate elevation to make sure that we're only going to trusted sources. But procurement personnel need to be aware of the risk of counterfeit parts. Inspection personnel, if something doesn't quite look right, make sure that we call, and alert people to go look for this. Last couple of years, I've been speaking at the NASA Quality Leadership Forum. And I tease you not, probably half of the speakers are talking about counterfeit parts. What's scary is that counterfeit parts have gotten so good, it's almost impossible to be able to go tell them, just by looking at the parts. And what's even worse is that sometimes when you test them at the nominal ranges, they still even test fine. It's when you get to the extremes, all right, to the whole range of performance specifications, when sometimes some of the counterfeit parts will come out and show their true colors. Also, we have a new requirement for obsolescence management in our design and development process. Once again, make sure we have adequate controls for acquiring parts, assuring traceability of parts to where we receive them at. Verification and test methodologies, if we have a risk of counterfeit parts, all right, or a particular type of part, how we can go identify, mark, test those parts to see when they're a problem. Counterfeit parts reporting, all right, guide up alerts. Do we have ways of being able to look at when industry's having a problem with counterfeit parts, so we don't need to go try to find everything ourselves. Let's learn from others. Let's share information as much as possible. We need to make sure we quarantine and report internal incidences as appropriate. A lot of times there's government investigations if there is counterfeit parts, so make sure you maintain the parts for those investigations. Make sure that we also want to make sure that these parts don't get back into the supply chain. So we need to make sure we segregate control, suspect, or known counterfeit parts to make sure that they're not reintroduced into the supply chain. Okay, so that's some of the 8.1 new requirements. 8.2, customer communication. So it's a little bit interesting as you see a little bit different of an order of some of these items from 2009. We have a new requirement with regards to contingency actions. 8.2.2, we have a requirement now saying you need to make sure that your organization can meet the claims for the products and services it provides. As I mentioned, you'll see additional coordination with functions for the contract review. Also, if you're not meeting customer requirements, what actions are you taking? Usually you have like a deviation waiver process for these types of things. And then, of course, changes to those requirements. 8.3, new layout of the requirements. Restructured, so it's more like a process. So you see it goes to a general section, then planning, inputs, controls that include design reviews, verification, validation, then outputs. Before the structure was planning, inputs, outputs, design reviews, verification, validation. So it's more in a logical flow right now. A little bit more flexibility of determining stages and controls depending upon the nature, duration, complexity of the design, right? You want to break the design down into logical pieces. Some people ask me the question, how much is enough? Well, it varies depending upon the complexity. If I have a tool design, it'll be fairly simple versus a 787 I'm designing, as an example, okay? What's the document information needed to demonstrate compliance to requirements? As I mentioned, there's a requirement for obsolescence, now design development. Design development controls. Sometimes when we do engineering lab activities, they're almost kind of like a hobby shop or like what my garage looks like. No, these need to be in a controlled environment. So we need to have like monitoring and measuring devices that are calibrated and tested and properly controlled. We need to make sure we have chemicals that are within date, okay? Outputs do need to be approved by authorized persons prior to release. And changes. Add a requirement for a process and criteria for notifying customers about changes that affect customer requirements. So if your design change is going to affect the customer requirements levied to you, you need to go communicate that to your customer. 8.4, control of externally provided process, products, and services. So we used to have a clause called purchasing, and then 4.1 talked to outsourcing. This kind of pulls everything together into one. It's one of the really good enhancements that ISO, I think, made. So anything that you get outside the scope of your quality management system needs to be controlled through clause 8.4. This can be suppliers. This can be both suppliers as products as well as services. This can be a sister organization that's not within your scope of certification. This can be a partner organization. This can be your corporate headquarters, once again, if it's not included into your scope of certification, okay? The general section, right, we talked some here about direct and sub-tier external providers. So what we're seeing is that sometimes the risk is not through my direct supplier, but it's their supplier or their supplier's suppliers. So how are we going to levy requirements to direct and sub-tier? We could do kind of like a peanut butter spread where we provide the same flow down requirements to everybody, basically saying, hey, whatever you flow down to you're required to flow down to your suppliers, or you could do it based upon risk. If there's a particular component that's higher risk, you want to flow down additional requirements, then that would be a good time to go flow down these additional controls within the system. Type and extent of control, right? If your organization requires test reports to verify conformity of products and services, then how are you going to make sure that those test reports meet the requirements? How are you going to go verify those for accuracy? So what we're seeing in some cases is that the organization says, I need a test report. When those test reports come in, they're just put in the file cabinet. They're not really looked at. That's not acceptable. If you require test reports to be included, how are you verifying those test reports make the product comply with requirements? Another one that re-entered was this validation process test reports for raw material. We had this requirement back in Rev B. We took it out in Rev C thinking that risk management was going to cover that, but it really didn't. We didn't see organizations having this thinking. So what was required in Rev B was for all raw materials to go periodically do validation tests. Obviously, this was kind of overkill because we're doing a lot of tests where the material criticality was really not very significant. So what we did is we added this significant operational risk. So you're going to go validate test reports for accuracy for raw materials identified as a significant operational risk. So what are you talking about? So let's say, for example, I have wing attach fittings. They're a titanium alloy. I want to make sure that those parts meet requirements, that is the correct titanium alloy. So therefore, I'm going to periodically send out those parts or that a coupon from that material to make sure it comes back as what it's supposed to be. I can send it out. I can do the checks internal within my own lab environment. Also, there's more explicit topics to be considered for external providers as well. So let's talk a little bit more about the test reports. To avoid non-compliance of test reports, right? How are you going to go determine what test reports are required, and how are you going to go check to make sure they're compliant before accepting the parts? For the raw material, incomplete, inaccurate, incomplete, or unduly altered test reports for raw material have introduced undue risk into critical applications. So right now we're focused on those higher risk components, all right? Obviously, if you have critical items, critical raw materials, it'll apply to them. How are you going to apply the process? You don't have to test necessarily from every batch. Do some testing up front, and then as you have confidence, you can do some reduction of your sampling. Okay? Apply the process, and then take appropriate necessary steps. 8.5, production service provision. Right, requires you to control processes and outputs, and that acceptance criteria are met. Under 851, this is where we have still control of equipment, tools, software programs, validation of special processes. What's interesting is you'll notice that that's bold italics. ISO actually boiled down the special process requirement to a single subclause. I think it's 851J or K, I can't remember which. So we added back a clause in its entirety in 9100, and then production process verification. Okay, not really any changes to identification traceability. Property, you'll see there it's been expanded. Property belonging to customers or external providers. So sometimes external providers will deliver their product in a tool or container, or they'll provide some kind of gauges, tooling. How are you going to go maintain that material and provide that back to your external provider. 853, basically, how do you protect things that don't belong to you? Okay, preservation, post-delivery activities. In the past, we had additional AS9100 clause because ISO did not cover post-delivery activities. Now they have a clause for this. So we added our 9100 additional content into post-delivery activities, okay? Control of changes, all right? We always have control of production processes. That's where this is, 856. Release of products and services. So thank goodness ISO's finally put this requirement in there, so now we can finally release products that we've been holding all this time. Obviously, we've had processes to release products and services, but in the structure that ISO now has, it's all focused now on in clause 8.6 on what do we require to before we release products to the customer. 8.7, once again, outputs can include products and services, and this is where that maintain procedure reference requirement still is there for control of non-conforming outputs. Clause 9, we still have basically the same, a little bit of embellishment for monitoring, measurement, analysis, evaluation, customer satisfaction, a little bit more requirements there where now you're not only required to maintain compliance to your customer requirements, but also regulatory statutory requirements. Analysis, evaluation, more emphasis, also using these inputs in your management review. Outputs of the analysis are clear. Internal audits, explicit topics to consider. We actually have a note now. Internal audits tend to focus on compliance. They should be looking at effectiveness as well, not only compliance. So how do you determine whether your processes are effective, whether they're delivering their planned results? Management review, several new requirements, including on-time delivery performance. Risk is now included in here as well. Improvement, nonconformity, corrective action. We have a requirement for human factors. Does this mean I need to go hire or set up a new department in my organization for human factors because that's a whole area of study? Absolutely not. The whole intent here is when we're taking root cause corrective actions, don't stop at operator error. Why was there an operator error? Okay, or workmanship. Why was there a workmanship error? All right, don't just stop when human nature. All right, why? This is also once again a procedure requirement. The annex was real excited that ISO maintained the annexes to make sure that there's clarity, that we, and once again, the annex is informative, it's for clarifications, it is not auditable text. There's also standards developed by ISO TC 176, as well as IAQG. Why go try to stumble and try to go figure out how to go do this? Why don't you use an international standard that's been accepted by industry? A little bit more about human factors. It's the understanding of the interaction between people, machine, each other, their impact on human performance. I would point you to the FAA Dirty Dozen if you're not familiar with human factors. Also, a warning with regard to human factors within the United States. Obviously, there's certain things that we can't get into. If you look at the example, recognition that persons performing tasks are affected by physical fitness. All right, if you're working people towards exhaustion, okay. Psychological characteristics, personality, stress, fatigue, distraction, communication, and attitude. All right. Some of these things, due to laws, especially here in the United States, we can't get into. But once again, the whole intent of the human factors is asking that why question. Human factors is not only here in the corrective action area, human factors considerations also in the environment for the operation of processes, the work environment. In 714, we talked a little bit about that then, as well as 851G, where we try to mistake proof. How do we try to prevent human errors? All right, we're trying to get rid of understand the importance of human factors and the origin of nonconformities to try to control the nonconformities. Make sure that we look at it from products, workplaces, equipment, and people for the organization, that we look at as part of root cause analysis. We capitalize on lessons learned on human errors. Okay? So implementation benefits. When you have a well-implemented and managed system, you produce continually improved, safe, reliable products. That's the ultimate goal, which of course increases company profitability and effectiveness. Meet or exceed customer regulatory requirements to ensure customer satisfaction. This is how we do business day to day. If you're not using your processes day to day, if it's only something you pull out when auditors come, you have done yourself a disservice in the development of your quality management system. Improve integration with business operations strategy. The documentation reflects the work performed, the actions taken. Focus on the complete supply chain stakeholders. We're trying to have fewer customer-specific documents as we try to have more common documents within industry, and 9100 is recognized by regulatory authorities. As you probably are aware, all audits are now being conducted to AS9100, 9110, 9120, 2016. The transition will be complete. So as of September of this year, 2009 certificates are no longer valid. A little bit of an adjustment that was released last month from IAF, International Accreditation Forum. As long as you have started your audits, all right, you will not have to start over again. So as long as you have started your audit by that September 2018, you will not have to start over again with the stage one. But until the time when your certification is approved, gone through, right, your audit, corrective action, verification, implementation, verification, executive review, until that happens, you would not be certified to the 2009 or the 2016 version. So it's best to have your transition complete by that September 2018 date. Okay. I've talked several times about deployment support material. If you go onto the iaqg.org, you can either go over here where it says deployment support material, or there's a yellow button right here. You can go directly to it. I kind of cut off the screen, but if you click deployment support materials 9100, here I'll provide all the different deployment support material. You can see presentations, recordings of webinars, correlation matrix that tie 9100 2009 to the 2016, frequently asked questions. Here's those clarifications I was talking about. Here's a quality progress article that I wrote back in August of 2016. There's actually, this has been updated. This one's been removed. There's I think it's October of 2017 and February of 2018 articles that are posted out there right now. There's a worksheet that you can download, that's a good gap analysis tool, and this 9100 evaluation guidance material. Excellent material. It's kind of like what to look for, what to ask It's not requirements, but it's kind of like brainstormed ways to go comply with the standard. ISO also has lots of good materials, but it's hard to find it, so I have links to their materials down here. Okay, let's see. I do have a couple questions. Cannot hear you. Okay. Hopefully that's been resolved. Let's see. Could I have this website again, please? And what I'll do is I'll go back to it. www.iaqg.org. Are there any other questions before we end this webinar? Okay, let's see. Just making sure for AS, the quality manual is still mandatory. Actually, it is not. If you look at clause 442, there's material that is required. So let's talk a little bit about the quality manual. You may ask the question, why did ISO remove the requirement for a quality manual? And if you look back at what historically has been required for a quality manual, it's required that, I'm going to miss some, but it was required for you to have your sequence and interaction of your processes. It was required for you to have a scope of your system, okay? What did companies do? There's only like 4 things that were required. What did companies do? They regurgitated the whole entire AS9100 or ISO 9001 spec, all right? That was never required to have a quality manual. So what do we do for aviation, space, and defense? If you look at 442, we took those historical areas that were required for a quality manual, and we added a couple of other things to it. We talked about it in this webinar, all right? We talked about, well, let me go ahead and pull it up real quick. Okay. What's required is a general description of relevant interested parties, right? Obviously, every time you come in for an audit, you don't want the organization saying, so what are interested parties? We forgot we said last time. No, document that. That's important. Not to say they can't change over time, but there needs to be some basis that you keep that information. The scope of the quality management system, including boundaries and applicability, a description of the processes needed for the quality management system and their application throughout the organization, the sequence and the interaction of these processes, assignment of the responsibilities and authorities for these processes. And then the note, the above description of the quality management system can be compiled into a single source of document information. Matter of fact, I'd recommend that, right? To have all that document in one place, but it doesn't have to be, and referred to as a quality manual. What I said during the webinar was that I've not come across any companies that have not maintained their quality manual, all right? But it is not mandatory to have one. As long as you capture that information that I just read off, it is not required that be in a document called a quality manual. So hopefully that answered your question. Thank you, sir. What organizations can be exempted? Question, finance. You know, it's kind of interesting. I'll give you my spin on that, Mike. To me, it's not a quality management system, it's a business management system or a company management system. So it's how your company should operate. So to me, really nobody is exempted. And they say, well, wait a minute. And when I was working in industry or working at Lockheed, sometimes I'd go to activities and they'd say, what do you do? I'm like, well, I maintain the AS9100 system for the company. And people and payroll, I don't know why people in payroll are so brazen, but they are. Well, that doesn't affect us in payroll because you won't see payroll anywhere in that AS9100. And I'd say, so AS9100 is all about providing products and services, quality products and services to the customer on time. If we stop paying people, do you think that would be affected? Well, yeah, people would stop coming to work if you didn't pay them. Well, therefore, you do have an impact on the quality management system. Now, does that mean I'm going to go start doing audits of payroll? Probably not. Would I expect payroll to follow my document control, records, procedures, and so forth? Absolutely. Would I expect there to be competent people in payroll? Absolutely. So hopefully that answered your question, Mike. Can you go to the cover page, please? Whoops. I guess you're talking about that one? Okay. Where can we find this presentation? It'll be posted on the PJR website as well as the recording of this. So both the presentation and the website. Are there any common hiccups seen in upgrade audits that we should be aware of to prepare ourselves? There are some issues that we have seen. Organizational contacts, interested parties. A lot of organizations just don't quite get those concepts. So that's one area of risk that I've seen. The other is in the awareness. We talked about contribution to product service conformity, product safety, and the importance of ethical behavior. It's not only required for your organization, but it's also required for you to flow that down to your supply base in clause 8.4. So those are some common areas I've seen where there's been some problems. If you have other questions with regards to the material, recommend you contact Perry Johnson, Registrars. As far as my contact information, you can ask me a question on the OASIS website. It's probably the best way to get a hold of me. On 8.2, requirements for products and services, what are considered services? Do we need to document those? Once again, products and services are products and services delivered to your customer, all right? And so yes, so for example, I'm trying to think. So if you're going to go provide your product and then also go provide training of how to go use your product, yeah, that's part of your quality management system. So you'd need to have that documented as part of your system and consider all the clauses with regard to that particular service, okay? Or if you're going to provide servicing to the product, all right? What about IT? Cannot be exempted. You know, IT is a critical piece of the infrastructure, especially now with the way we have embellished it with regards to information protections, virus protections, backup provisions. I don't see how you could possibly think that IT does not affect product and service conformity to deliver to your customer on time. Would you recommend to have a risk management procedure? A lot of that depends upon your organization, the size of your organization, the complexity associated with that. In your personal opinion, would you do away with the quality manual and procedures? You know, I hate to answer a question with it depends. I would ask the question of, in your organization, what value does the quality manual have? Okay? If your quality manual has value, where you're providing that to customers to say, here's our quality management system, yeah, that makes sense to maintain the quality manual. If what you're doing is you know, I don't think personally it has value to regurgitate the standard. I really like quality manuals that talk to your processes and is kind of that top level document that kind of defines the organization. All right, several thank yous. And right on time, how about that? Well, on behalf of PJR, I thank you for your participation in this webinar. I hope that it's been informative to you. You have a great day. Thank you very much.